Today you will learn the entire story of Job like you have never seen it before. Everything you will learn here is contained in the book of Job in the Bible. There lived a man named Job, a righteous and upright man who was of God and avoided doing what Job did. And he only had 7 sons and 3 daughters and 7,000 sheep, 1,000 camels, 500 pairs of oxen, 500 donkeys and many servants. He was the richest man in the East. When he called them early in the morning and cleansed them, he offered a burnt offering to each of them, because he thought that perhaps my children had sinned and cursed God in their hearts. When the Lord came with them to the Lord asked Satan, "Where are you from?" He responded by wandering the earth and walking on it, and the Lord said to Satan, "Beware of my servant Job, for there is no one like him on the earth, blameless, upright, fearing God and eschewing evil." He replied, Satan, to Job, "Have you reason to fear me? Either way, he will certainly curse you to your face." Satan, yes, everything he had was in his hands, just don't touch him. So one day when Job's sons and daughters were with them at a party, Satan left the presence of the Lord, Mercer, came to the door of the mountain and told Jay that the oxen were plowing the fields and the donkeys were grazing. Sabius and Asprigos, especially I, fled to the God of heaven seas inant est fando cho outs and dis f. I completely burned the sheep and killed the servants, and was the only one burned to death. The messenger said that the Chaldeans divided themselves into 3 groups and attacked the camels and took them and killed the servants with swords, and I was the only one who escaped. And while he was still speaking, he said another messenger came and said that while his son and my daughter were eating and drinking at a banquet in his brother's house, suddenly a strong wind came from the desert and blew in the 4 corners of the house. They all died, and I was the only one to tell you. He shaved his head, then fell on his stomach and worshipped, saying that I came out of my mother's womb naked, and I will come out naked, given by the Lord, and in all this I will praise the name of the Lord. Job did not sin and did not sin. God on other occasions angels came to the Lord, and Satan was among them. The man was as innocent as he was. A righteous man who fears God and shuns evil, who remains blameless even though you provoke me against him and destroy him without just cause. Beat your flesh and body. Painful wounds were left from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. So Job took a piece. Sitting in the ashes and scraping the clay vessels, his wife said to him, "You still maintain your integrity and curse God. Go to hell," he replied. "You speak like a fool. We will accept the goodness of God, and we will not be in all this evil." Job did not sin with his lips. And comfort him. Sitting on the floor for 7 days and nights, no one said a word because they saw how much pain he was in after what happened to him. Shrouded in darkness without light. It's a shame he wasn't buried as a child where he could rest in peace. Job questioned, why do those in deep suffering receive life, longing for the death that does not come? He expressed his deep despair, saying that what he feared most happened, and that he had no peace, only restlessness. After that, Job's friend named Eliphaz responds to Job, starting with an observation about Job having helped many with his words and actions, strengthening the weak and encouraging the wavering. However, now that Job is in difficulty, he becomes discouraged and loses hope. He wonders why Job's godliness and blameless conduct do not give him confidence and hope. He goes on to say that the innocent do not perish and the upright do not suffer destruction. He states that those who sow evil will reap destruction by the breath of God. He uses the metaphor of lions to illustrate that even the strong can be broken and dispersed. He reports a night vision in which a spirit questions whether any mortal can be more just or pure than God. He argues that if God does not trust even his celestial servants and sees errors even in angels, how much more so in fragile humans? He concludes that humans are easily crushed and die without wisdom. He then advises Job to acclaim God by presenting his cause to him, for God performs unfathomable wonders and exalts the humble. He frustrates the plans of the cunning and saves the oppressed, giving hope for the poor. He emphasizes that man is happy when God corrects him and should not despise the discipline of the Almighty, because God both wounds and heals. He assures Job that God will deliver him from many misfortunes and that he will be protected from evil. He does paint a picture of prosperity and security for those who trust in God, stating that Job will be able to count on the security of his family and descendants, ending with an exhortation for Job to listen and apply these teachings to his life. After he does so, Job responds by expressing the depth of his anguish and despair in response to the words of his friends, he begins lamenting that his affliction is so great that it cannot be compared even to the sand of the seas. Job feels that the arrows of God are reaching him, and that he is being tormented by God. Job wished that God would grant his request to end his life so that he could find comfort and not deny God's words. He wonders what hope he can have if he no longer has strength and feels without a future, comparing his strength to that of stones, bronze and power that can help him now. He criticizes his friends, comparing the air to temporary streams that dry up in the dry season, leading to a disappointment similar to that felt by travelers who seek water in vain. He feels that his friends have failed to offer him help, and they are filled with fear when they see their situation. Job claims that he did not ask them for anything in return and challenges his friends to show him where he went wrong. He feels that his words are despised and that they try to correct what he says as if they were mere winds. He accuses them to be unjust and challenges them to reconsider their situation, stating that their integrity is at stake. Job continues to express his hopelessness with life by comparing the work and days of men on earth to those of a wage earner awaiting payment. He describes his situation with images of physical suffering and emotional his life passing quickly without hope. He asks God to remember that his life is fleeting and that he will never see happiness again. Job feels that just as a cloud disappears, he too will disappear with no return, and no one will ever see him again. In the end, Job opens up about the pain and bitterness of his soul, questioning the importance that God gives to him, and because he is examined before, he wonders why God does not forgive his offenses and erase his sins, because he will soon be buried and there will be no more Bildad. One of Job's friends responds critically to Job's words that express his anguish and question God's justice. Bildad argues that Job's language is a great whirlwind and suggests that he is speaking recklessly. Bildad asks if God really distorts justice, and if the Almighty can do what is wrong. He argues that God does not pervert justice, and that when Job's children sinned, God punished them. Bildad advises Job to seek and beg God, promising that if he is righteous and pure, God will rise up on his behalf and restore his position. He suggests that Job's current situation is temporary, and that his future will be prosperous. He suggests that Job should learn from that of past generations and listen to what his parents taught, because wisdom comes with time and experience. Bildad concludes that God does not reject the righteous and does not strengthen the wicked. He states that if Job repents and is righteous, God will turn his sorrow into joy and make his enemies ashamed. He predicts that the houses of the wicked will disappear. In summary, Bildad criticizes Job's stance, stating that his situation is the result of his own sins and that God's justice will prevail. He encourages Job to repent and trust in God, promising that this will lead to a restoration and a more promising future. After that, Job responds to his friend Bildad with a profound reflection on the impossibility of a mortal justifying himself before God. He expresses a feeling of helplessness and inability to face or argue with the Almighty. Job recognizes the truth in the observations made by Bildad, but questions how a human being can be righteous before God. He believes that even if he tried to argue with God, he would not be able to argue successfully. Job describes the depth of wisdom and the magnitude of the power of God that can move mountains, shake the earth, and hide the light of the sun. He states that God performs wonders that are incomprehensible, and that even when God passes by him, Job is unable to perceive him. J expresses that even if he were innocent, he would be unable to respond to God. He only could beg for mercy because he believes that God would not listen to his pleas and that his situation would be worsened without reason. Job laments that regardless of being righteous or impious, God seems to destroy himself to everyone equally. He mentions that when a disaster occurs, God seems to mock the pain of the innocents, and that there is no one who can challenge divine justice or question their actions. Job compares his days to a constant and fast flow without joy. He says that even trying to change his countenance and smile, his sufferings still terrify him, because he believes that God would not consider him innocent. Job expresses the frustration of not being able to appeal to an arbiter or judge between himself and God. He wants someone who can mediate between them, removing the divine terror and allowing him to speak without fear. Job is in a state of deep despair and anguish. He feels that it is impossible for a human being, no matter how fair, to argue or justify himself in the face of the immensity and power of God. Job recognizes the greatness and absolute dominion of God, who makes him feel powerless and helpless. His main complaint is the lack of a mediator who can intervene and alleviate his anguish, making the situation even more desperate. After Job speaks, His mocking friend responds to Job with a series of criticisms and advice. He refutes the claims of Job and suggests that Job's suffering is a consequence of his own sins. Zophar also offers a path to restoration and a life of prosperity. Zophar begins by criticizing Job's words, calling them foolish, and questioning whether anyone will rebuke him for his mockery and presumption. He suggests that Job's words are just a waste of time, and that he is being unwise to mock. Expresses the desire that God would speak directly to Job and reveal the secrets of divine wisdom. He claims that the true wisdom is complex and that God probably forgot some of Job's sins. He highlights that the mysteries and limits of God are unfathomable and infinite, higher than the heavens and deeper than the depths. No one can fully understand the greatness and power of God. Zophar advises Job to consecrate his heart to God, to turn away from sin and eliminate evil from his life. He suggests that if this can restore his dignity and have a life without shame, he promises that if Job repents and turns to God, he will forget his misfortunes, will have a life brighter than noon, and will enjoy security and prosperity. Zophar states that Job will live without fear and will have the favor of others. Zophar ends by predicting that the wicked will suffer and seek in vain a refuge, with death being the only hope left for them. Job responds to his friends, refuting their accusations and reflecting on the power and wisdom of God. He states that he is not inferior to his friends in wisdom and expresses his discontent with the situation in which finds himself. Job begins by challenging his friends, stating that they do not have a monopoly on wisdom, and that he has the same reasoning capacity as them. He is offended by the fact that he becomes the target of ridicule despite having been a just and God-fearing person. Job ironically observes that those who are well in life often despise the misfortune of others, and that although it seems that the wicked prosper, this does not necessarily reflect the justice of God. Job highlights that even animals and nature recognize the power and wisdom of God. He emphasizes that the life and breath of all humanity are in the hands of God, who is the only true holder of wisdom and understanding. Job describes God's ability to destroy and rebuild, to control water and drought, and to exercise authority over everyone, including deceivers and deceived. He mentions that God can strip and depose authorities, whether kings, priests, or elders. He is deeply distressed and frustrated with his situation and the accusations of his friends. He defends his integrity and he wants a direct audience with God so that his cause can be judged fairly, after which he befriends Job and begins by calling Job's arguments empty and useless. He suggests that Job is talking nonsense, as if he were filling his stomach with wind to a leaf. Job is stifling piety and diminishing devotion to God, accusing him of being moved by sin and adopting the language of the cunning. He questions whether Job was the first to be born or whether he has special knowledge that no one else has. He highlights that there are people more old and wise than Job, and that divine consolations and words of wisdom from friends are not enough for him. He accuses Job of directing his wrath against God and pouring out words against the Almighty. He argues that no human being can be pure or fair, for all are born impure and corrupt. He reinforces the idea that even sacred things are not pure in the eyes of God. He then describes the fate of the wicked, explaining that they suffer torment during life and are tormented by noises and attacks. He states that the wicked have no hope of escaping darkness and are destined for suffering. He describes the wicked as someone who faces anguish and torment by defying God with arrogance. He suggests that despite his wealth and status, the wicked will end up in ruins and his wealth will not last. He warns that the wicked should not trust in worthless things, as they will not receive compensation. He compares the life of the wicked to a stripped vineyard and an olive tree without fruit. He states that the wicked end up in ruins and that fire devours his possessions in the end. He concludes that the wicked generate evil and deceit. Job responds by criticizing his friends, calling them poor comforters. He feels frustrated with the uselessness of their speeches and questions why they continue to argue with him. Job believes that if he were in instead, he could easily condemn them with insightful words, but instead he would seek to console and soothe them. J expresses that their pain is not eased by words, whether speaking or remaining silent. He feels that God exhausted him and brought his family to an end. Job describes his physical and emotional pain, saying that God attacked him in anger, left him depressed and exposed to the mockery of men. Job feels attacked and mistreated by God and the wicked. He describes himself as the target of relentless attacks and compares his situation to that of a warrior who is constantly attacked. He feels that his situation is so desperate that he wears mourning and buries his forehead in the dust. Job makes an appeal that his cause not be ignored, and may your cry not be Forgotten he claims to have a lawyer and intercessor in heaven who defends his cause. He sees God as his only defender in the face of the injustice he is facing, recognizes that close to death, feeling that his grave is his inevitable destiny. He sees himself as a proverb and an object of mockery, and his eyes are filled with sadness. He observes that despite their sufferings the righteous will stand firm and become stronger. Job is frustrated with his friends who offer him inadequate comfort and criticizes their words as useless. After that, Bildad, Job's friend, responds to Job, harshly criticizing and reinforcing the idea that suffering is a direct consequence of sin. Bildad tries to convince Job that his situation is the result of his impiety. Bildad begins by asking Job to stop talking and start to act sensibly. He questions why Job considers his friends as ignorant, insinuating that Job sees himself as superior to them. Bildad criticizes Job for being lost in wrath, questioning whether the earth should be abandoned or the rocks moved because of. Job's anger reinforces the idea that ruin is the natural consequence of not knowing God and suggests that Job is suffering because he is wicked. Job responds to his friends by expressing his deep anguish and frustration at their accusations and lack of compassion. Job begins lamenting his friends' persistence in tormenting him with words, repeatedly reprimanding him without showing shame or compassion. Job argues that if he has truly gone astray, it is his mistake and should not be a reason for humiliation by others. Job accuses his friends of exalting themselves over him and using his humiliating situation against him. Job attributes his suffering directly to God, saying that it was God who treated him badly, blocked his path, covered his paths with darkness, took away his honor and hope, and sees him as an enemy. He describes the wrath of God and how he feels surrounded and attacked. Job laments the abandonment of his brothers, friends, relatives, guests, servants, wife, and even children. He feels isolated and rejected by everyone he knew. Job describes his deteriorated physical state, reduced to skin and bones, and begs for mercy from his friends, stating that he has already been wounded by the hand of God and needs no further persecution. Job expresses the desire that his words be recorded forever. He makes a powerful declaration of faith, stating that he knows that his Redeemer lives and that in the end he will see God with his own eyes even after his body is destroyed. Job warns his friends to fear the sword, i.e. God's judgment, suggesting that they too may face divine wrath for their actions against him. He implies that they should reflect on their own attitudes and recognize that there is a judgment that awaits them. Job responds with an intense outburst, criticizing his friends for their constant reprimands and lack of compassion. Mocking one of Job's friends responds to Job's words. Mocking begins by saying that his thoughts are agitated and he is deeply disturbed, leading him to respond. He feels dishonored by Job's rebuke and feels he must respond. To defend his understanding, Zophar responds to Job with a firm speech, stating that the prosperity of the wicked is temporary and that their destiny is destruction. He describes the ephemeral nature of the joy of the wicked and how their unjust actions will lead them to ruin. Zophar believes that divine justice will inevitably overtake them, resulting in disgrace, revelation of their guilt, and complete destruction. He concludes that this is the inheritance that God reserves for the wicked, reinforcing the idea that divine justice will prevail. Job responds to his friends and reflects on the apparent prosperity of the wicked. Confronting his ideas about divine justice, he questions the comfort his friends offer him and expresses his frustration and anguish. J reflects on the apparent prosperity of the wicked and how this challenges the notion of divine justice. He observes that the wicked often live long and prosperous lives, rejecting God, and yet they do not face apparent misfortunes. Job criticizes the idea that the punishment of the wicked is reserved for their children and argues that the wicked should suffer the consequences of their own actions. He also reflects on the avoidability of death for everyone regardless of their life circumstances. At the end, Job expresses his frustration with his friends, calling their attempts at comfort useless and false. He does. One of Job's friends responds to him with an accusation and advice. He does questions the usefulness of humans to God and accuses Job of great sins, suggesting that the calamities Job faces are the result of his own transgressions. He advises Job to turn to God and seek reconciliation, promising that the prosperity and peace will come as a result of this action. He suggests that the only way for Job to find peace and prosperity is to submit to God, accept his instruction, and turn away from injustice. He makes promises that if Job follows this advice, he will find pleasure in God, will be heard in your prayers, and the light will shine on your paths, and may even save others. Job responds to his friend, expressing his suffering and frustration with his situation. He wants to find God to present his case and prove his innocence. J is confused and distressed. Because although he follows God's commandments and is faithful, he cannot understand why he is suffering so much. Job questions why God does not establish clear times for judgment, and expresses his frustration with the apparent prosperity of the wicked. He describes a series of injustices that the poor and needy suffer, while the wicked seem to escape unharmed. J observes that the wicked commit crimes and rebel against the light, but eventually, even though they seem firmly established, God uproots them and their lives have no security. He concludes by challenging anyone to prove that he is lying by reaffirming the injustice he sees in the world. Bildad, one of Job's friends, responds to Job. Bildad exalts the greatness, sovereignty, and purity of God, highlighting how dominion and fear belong exclusively to him. He highlights the human being's impossibility of being righteous or pure before God, using the celestial purity of the moon and stars as a measure that is still insufficient by divine standards. Concludes by underlining the insignificance of man in comparison to God, describing him in a very humble and even derogatory way as a maggot or worm. Job responds with sarcasm and irony to the observations of his friends. Probably the Bildad who had just spoken about the greatness of God and the insignificance of man. Job begins by criticizing the useless help of his friends, and then gives a beautiful description of the power of highlighting the divine greatness. Job continues his defense in the face of his friends' accusations, affirming his integrity and describing the injustice and suffering that Job is experiencing. Swears by the God that he feels has denied him justice, stating that he will never speak evil or falsely. He pledges to maintain his integrity and righteousness until death, refusing to give reason to his friends. J speaks of God's absolute power over the universe, saying that God sees everything and controls everything. He mentions that even the ends of the earth are under God's watch, and that he is the only one who knows the path of wisdom. Job remembers with nostalgia the days when God took care of him and he was respected in society. He was a great man. Influence and respect, helping those in need and being praised by all. J laments how he is now despised even by young people whose parents he would not have considered worthy. He feels attacked, dishonored, and afflicted. Job describes how God treated him severely by throwing him into the mud and reducing him to dust and ashes. He reflects on his fair and compassionate conduct throughout his life, helping the poor, widows, and orphans, and being fair in his actions. He never trusted in material riches and always avoided evil. Job highlights that he never rejoiced in the misfortune of his enemies and was always generous to those in need. Job concludes by defying any accusation against him, reaffirming his innocence and the integrity of his actions. He desires that the Almighty respond to his complaints and that his defense be written and taken before God. Then these three men stopped responding to Job because he thought he was righteous. But he, the son of Barachel of Bus, from the family of Job, was very angry with Job because he was justified before God. He was also angry with his three friends because he was not. They found ways to refute Job, and even so they condemned him. Elihu had been waiting to speak to Job because they were older than him, but when he saw that the three had nothing more to say, he became indignant. So Elihu, son of Barachel of Bus, spoke to me. I'm young. You're old, that's why I was afraid, and I didn't dare tell you what I know. Those who are old should speak. I thought advanced years should teach wisdom. But it's the spirit within a man that gives him understanding. The breath of Almighty are not just the elderly. The wise are not just the old ones who understand what is right. So I say, listen to me, I will also tell you what I know. Elihu argues that God can use suffering to correct and redeem man, preventing pride and destruction. He reinforces it that God is just and does not do evil. He makes no distinction between rich and poor and rules justice. Universally criticizes Job for stating that it is not worth pleasing God and for rebelling against his justice. He describes the majesty and power of God, comparing it to strength of nature such as storms and lightning. He emphasizes that the understanding of God is beyond human capacity and that divine justice is not easily understood or questioned. Elihu challenges Job to reflect on the greatness and justice of God and warns him about the temptation to question divine justice. He concludes by highlighting the immensity and perfection of God, who is worthy of reverence and fear. Then the Lord answered Job from the middle of the storm, saying, Who is this who obscures my advice with words devoid of wisdom? Prepare to answer like a common man. I will ask you questions, and you will give me answers. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Answer me. If you know so much, who determined its measurements? You can know, and who drew upon it the measuring line on which its pillars were set, and who placed the stone while the morning stars sang in leather, and all the angels rejoice, who held the sea with doors when it emerged from the mother's womb, when I clothed it with clouds and enveloped it in darkness dense. When I defined your limits and placed doors and barriers, when I told you this far you can come but not beyond this point here, I put an end to your proud waves. Have you already given orders tomorrow, or revealed to Aurora her place, so that she could grab the earth by the corners, and the shaking of the wicked? The earth is molded like a seal in clay, and everything in it appears like a garment. Light is denied to the wicked, and their arm is broken. Have you ever explored the springs of the sea, or walked the dark depths of the abyss? Have you seen the doors of death? Do you know the gates of darkness? Do you have any idea of the extent of the earth? Tell me if you know how to go to the place where the light lives and where the abode of darkness is. You can guide them to their appropriate places. Do you know the way to your dwellings? Maybe you know because you were already born and you have lived so many years. You have already entered the storehouses of Neve, or seen the storehouses of Sareva that I keep for times of distress, for days of war and combat, where lightning is distributed, where it spreads the winds. Easterners across the earth, who opened a channel for the torrential rain and a path for the thundering storm, to make it rain on the uninhabited earth in the desert, where there is no one to quench the thirst of the arid land, and make the vegetation grow. If the rain has a father, who he is the father of the dewdrops from which ice comes, and who gives the light that falls from the heavens when the waters become hard as stone and the surface of the abyss freezes. You can bind the beautiful Pleiades, you can loosen the ropes of Orion, can make the constellations appear in the right time, or make the bear and her cubs come out. You know the laws of the heavens. You can determine God's dominion over the earth. You can raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood. It is you who sends the lightning, and they respond here. We are the one who has given wisdom to the heart, and understanding to the one who has the wisdom to evaluate the clouds, who is able to pour out the waters from the heavens when the dust solidifies and the clods of earth gather together. It is you who hunts the prey for the lioness and feeds the lion cubs when they hide in their holes or lie in wait in the bush, who provides food to the crows when their young cry out to God and wander for lack of food. You know when the mountain goats give birth. You are attentive. When the deer has her young, you count the months until they give birth. You know when they bring their young into the world, they bend down, they give birth, and then they are freed from the pain of childbirth. Their young grow in the fields and become strong. They leave and never return. Who freed the wild donkey, who undid its bonds? I gave to the desert donkey as his home, and the dry beds of salt lakes as his abode. They amuse themselves with the tumult of the city, and do not hear the cry of the shepherds. He roams the hills in search of pasture, and seeks what is green. Does the wild ox. He will accept to work for you, and spend the night with the lame in your corral. You can tie him in the ditch with a harness. He will plow the valleys for you. You will trust him because of his great strength. You will leave the heavy work that you need to do to him. You can be sure that he will collect his wheat and store it on his threshing floor. The ostrich flaps its wings with joy, and as for the stork's wings and plumage, it leaves its eggs on the ground, and allows the sand to warm them without worrying that a foot might crush them, or that any animal savage can trample them. She treats her young as if they weren't her own, and doesn't care if their effort is worthless. This happens because God didn't give her wisdom or discernment yet. When she spreads her wings to run, she laughs at the horse, and the rider is you who gives strength to horse, or adorns his neck with his waving mane. You make him jump like a grasshopper, spreading terror with his majestic snort. He exudes his strength with pleasure and faces weapons with bravery. He disdains fear and does not retreat before the sword. His quiver swings at his side together with the flaming spear and javelin. In a furious frenzy he devours the ground. He cannot wait for the sound of the trumpet. When he hears it, he neighs, and from afar he can smell the combat, the signal of attack and the war cry. It is by his wisdom that falcon flies high and spreads its wings to the south. It is at his command that the eagle rises and builds his nest in the heights. A cliff is his home where he spends the night. A rocky cliff is his refuge. From there he goes in search of food. From afar their eyes find her, their puppies drink blood, and where there are dead there she is. The Lord continued talking to Job. Can someone who challenges the Almighty correct him, that the one who accuses him comes forward to respond to God? So Job responded, to the Lord I recognize my unworthiness as